Hello and welcome. This is a podcast explaining Ukraine by UkraineWorld.org. We continue our podcasts about the war which Russia started against Ukraine. This series is brought to you by Internews Ukraine and Ukraine Crisis Media Center, two Ukrainian media NGOs. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm chief editor of UkraineWorld.org, and I'm joined by Tetyana Ogarkova, who is in charge of international outreach at Ukraine Crisis Media Center. Hello, Tanya.
Hello.
So before we start, let me remind you that you can support us on Patreon, patreon.com/UkraineWorld. And today we decided to talk with you about more background. We will try to talk about Ukrainian identity, try to analyze who are Ukrainians, who they are, what do they want, so that you have the idea, if you are new to the Ukrainian topic, if you are new to this Eastern European topic, so that you have the idea what are the roots of what's going now, and why Ukrainians, for example, are making such a huge resistance against Russian invasion.
Yeah, this is an extremely interesting and fundamental question, because we are always asked about who you are and what do you want. Because what we see now, that a lot of international community, they do understand that what ex-president of Ukraine wrote many years ago. He said that Ukraine is not Russia. So this is a common statement, this is a common thesis, which is quite clear. And this is one of the reasons why, for example, this war started, this large-scale war started, because Putin is fighting here against, as he said in the beginning, against Nazification and militarization of Ukraine, which is anti-Russian. So he's fighting against Ukraine, which is not Russia. And yesterday, he repeated that, he enlarged his statement, saying that, well, we are also fighting for Russia and for its place on planet, something like that. So it is quite clear for international communities that Ukraine is kind of alternative to Russia. It is not Russia. It is on the opposite Russia. But still, a lot of questions. What does it exactly mean to be anti-Russia? What kind of opposition, what kind of positive statement are we able to do today about our identity, about our history, about our future?
I think there are some key differences between Ukrainian and Russian as political nations. It is very important to understand Ukraine not as an ethnic project or linguistic project or only ethnic linguistic project, but as a kind of a very deep tradition, political tradition. I think that what makes Ukraine different compared to Russia is a very specific attitude to politics. Because Ukrainian political tradition, sees the politics as a process of bottom-up process, right? Meaning that something starts as a gathering of people in a community, what Ukrainians are calling a hromada. A hromada means community, and it's a very important Ukrainian concept. It's a concept which is now intrinsically linked to the reform of self-governance in Ukraine. But the origins we can see, for example, in the 19th century of such philosophers as Mikhailo Drahomanov, one of the leading Ukrainian intellectuals of the 19th century. And what is Hromada? It's a community of people, self-governing community of people who gather together to decide on some issues. And when Drahomanov was, developing his story about Hromadas, he was saying that, look, there is a community, then there are what he was called a Hromada of Hromadas, or community of communities, meaning a state. So the state is kind of an integration of a multiplicity of Hromadas. And then what is the world, international politics, is against this third level of this community, the community of communities, right?
Mm-hmm. This is a question linked to the question of leadership. So what we see in Ukraine in history and also now, there is kind of collective leadership. We've seen that many times, for example, in recent history in Maidan, because in Maidan, we remember in 2013-14, yes, we had some leaders who were speaking all the time at the scene of Maidan, but they were not them who decided on what was going on. Do you remember that? And for example, it's also the root of many mistakes Russia Russia is making right today. Remember, 3 weeks ago, when Russia attacked Ukraine on the 24th of February, the idea was to kill or to capture Zelensky. And they were convinced that this could change something, because if you kill Zelensky, you can conquer this country, because they think in their terms, in this up and down communication and governance, thinking that if you kill the leader, you will kill a nation. But it simply doesn't work in Ukraine, because we do understand that even if, imagine, I would not like to imagine that, because we hope that it will never happen, but even if Zelensky will be out of the game, there will be somebody on his place. And we are all presidents, as Zelensky said several years ago. In a way, this is a collective leadership. This is not a kind of one leader who decides everything, like in Russia. And this has really, as you're absolutely right, Volodya, saying that this has explicit historical roots in these communities, in these hromadas, in this network of people and self-governance.
And this is why when you travel through Ukraine right now, and we are traveling actually a lot, we see that on the initial stages of war, every single village had its own defense, had its own barricades, had its own territorial defense, up to the level that the central government says, whoa, stop a little bit, because we cannot, the roads are not functioning, because it takes so much time to get through these checkpoints. And this is the self-organization spirit of Ukrainians. You can trace this back to the Revolution of Dignity of 2013-14, to the Orange Revolution of 2004 and 5, in which we have seen the same, well, we have not only seen but participated with you in this process, the same spirit of self-organization, but it goes much deeper, and our audience needs to understand that it goes much deeper into history, into centuries. And indeed, while Russia is presenting kind of a top-down version of politics, there is a Tsar, a tyrant, an autocrat, and everybody else is dependent on him, is frightened, is scared about him. But one day they will obviously kill him, themselves. In Ukraine, it's different. It's bottom-up politics. So even if the head is cut, for example, the self-organization spirit will continue.
And this explains, let me add maybe, why this explains the fact why, for example, volunteers movement is so powerful in Ukraine. We've seen that back in 2013-14 during Maidan and in this first war with Russia. I mean, at the time when Crimea was annexed and Donbass was occupied, we do remember this extremely powerful volunteers movement, people who were helping army. You remember, we didn't have army, in fact, in 2014. Back in 2014, we remember people going to the front without arms, without clothes, without anything. And we win this war. We do remember that a huge part of these territories in Lugansk and Donetsk regions were freed by Ukrainian army. But and this, and also volunteers movement helping internally displaced people. You remember we traveled a lot at that time, and we were writing articles as journalists about these people. We were traveling to the east, but also to the west, and we were seeing people who did incredibly fantastic things with IDPs, internally displaced people. It explained that Ukrainians are somehow able to self-organize, to create networks, to make things together without any orders. That's the idea that Ukrainians, they act not because President Zelensky ordered them to do so, but because they understand what is the Ukrainian interest, what is the common interest.
And Russians never understood that, and therefore the key propaganda against Ukrainian democracy is that Ukrainian democracy is basically curated by some people in the West. And the key propaganda is that all those demonstrations, all those revolutions were paid. And this is ridiculous. When Ukrainians are hearing that, this is ridiculous, because Ukrainians are paying to build the army. They are paying themselves to make revolutions. and not being paid by somebody else, because this is not what motivates them. But again, let's go deep into history. And Ukraine did not appear in 1991. Ukraine did not even appear in early 20th century, when there was a very important moment of Ukrainian independence, the so-called Ukrainian People's Republic. But it goes deeper in history. It goes as deep as Middle Ages. The powerful statehood on the current Ukrainian, partially Belarusian, partially Russian territories was called Rus. Don't mix it up with Russia, because Russia is a very later term, and by the way, mostly invented by Kiev intellectuals, because Russia is a Greek version of the word Rus, and Russia is a Latin version of the word Rus. But the word Rus is not Slavic word, it's a Scandinavian word. It's coming from Sweden, Finland, probably so-called Varangians. So the history of medieval Rus is deeply linked to the Scandinavians and to Greeks. Kiev was a place, was the hub between the north and the south, something that connected the north and the south, the Varangian, Scandinavian north, and Greek Byzantine south in the 9th, 10th, 11th century. Kiev existed long before Moscow. Kiev was a place where Christianity entered Eastern Europe, entered in Eastern Slavs. Moscow would be founded after 3 centuries after that. So Kiev has a much deeper history. And when we're talking about colonization, imperialism, Russian imperialism, etc., with Kiev history, with Ukrainian history, it's a much difficult topic, because surely Russians have their colonization plan with regard to Ukraine. But in many aspects, Ukrainian lands were actually the beginning of the civilization coming to barbarian northern countries of Muscovy.
I think this point is extremely important, and it explains, at least partially, why the war started. Because one could ask why Putin started this cruel, this unnecessary war against Ukraine. What happened, in fact? We were coexisting for 3 decades already, since the independence, since the end of the Soviet Union. What happened? Why Putin decided to do this extremely risky adventure, military? And we see we are at this end of the 3rd week of this war, and we see that Russia is not successful. It is extremely risky. Why he decided to do so? A lot of people are talking about this kind of mission he has in his mind. And when he tries to conquer or reconquer or to do something with Ukraine, it's not only to conquer territory. It is also about his adventures in time. Many European leaders, between them Olaf Scholz, Chancellor of Germany, and French President Emmanuel Macron, they were talking that Putin sounded very historically obsessed in the weeks which preceded his invasion. He's quite old. Let us talk about that. He's 70 years old. He's approaching his natural end. That is clear. And what he is trying to do for Russia, and he's deeply mistaken, but he's trying to play for time and to play for the very beginning of this civilization, in fact. And what you were talking about, that everything started in Kiev, back in centuries, and between north and south, and the Kiev was the starting point of this regional identity. Putin is now trying to reconquer the very beginning, this historical point, and this is why Kiev and Ukraine is something important. He's trying to control and to add not only the ancient colony, but the center, the heart, in a way, the heart of this civilization.
Yeah, in a way, Russia without Kiev in his mind is just a heartless,
heartless, maybe.
Or heartless
territory.
Cavalier, right? And but it's interesting that what he sees by Russia, basically, in the Rus of Kiev, has nothing to do with Russia, actually, because the political system of Rus was very pluralistic. It was rather a political system very close to, for example, Italy, medieval Italy, when you have city-states, when you had Florence, Venice, Rome, Naples, Milan. And they were, of course, sometimes cooperating between each other, sometimes coping between each other, competing with each other, making wars. But it was a pluralistic society, actually, and united by a common identity, but basically pluralistic. So there were multiple centers of influence. It was not an empire. It was not a tyrannical system with the top-down politics. So this is very important to understand this tradition, Ukrainian political tradition. Then, after the attack of the Mongols in the 13th century, it is well known that basically Kiev statehood was suspended for several centuries. We have another history of the currently Western Ukraine, when this Rus was centered in Halych, which is now Galicia, Halычina. Very, very interesting land, because for our listeners from Austria, for example, or from Central Europe, you know very well this crown land of Galicia, and the important place, for example, for Eastern European Jews. And they're both cultural important place, but also the tragedy during the Holocaust. But Halych, in Halych, there was a kingdom of Rus at one point. So Danilo, the king of Rus, was crowned actually by the Pope. So we see this link to the Western Christianity as well, not only to the Eastern Christianity. But then Ukrainian lands were existing first within the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, in which basically Ukrainian or Belarusian version of Eastern Slavic languages was considered as an official language. And then after the fusion of Lithuania and Poland into the statehood, which with very pronouncing name Respublika, or in Polish Rzeczpospolita, Ukrainian lands were kind of absorbed into this new big statehood in Central Europe, and influenced by them. So it's very important to see, for example, traditions of decentralized politics, because the Polish politics was very decentralized, in which the magnates, the elite, the Szlachta played a very important role, and again much more powerful than the king compared to other countries. And this tradition was also very important on Ukrainian lands. For example, the tradition of autonomous cities, autonomous towns, which in Ukraine we call Magdeburg law, but which is actually a German law inspired by Italian law, which is in itself inspired by the Roman law. So the idea that a community should be autonomous, independent with regard to kings, with regard to tyrants, etc. So this links Ukrainian lands very much to this European tradition of self-governance. I think if we formulate with one word what is European political tradition, is self-governance by individual are governing by themselves. It's coming from Aristotle, etc. By community, by the state, etc.
And just to link it once again, what this historical perspective you are presenting to what is going on today, let's look what was going on in 3 recent weeks. So we see that city leaders, mayors in Kiev, in Lviv, in Kharkiv, in Melitopol, are extremely important. So, and they play their autonomous role, and they are self-defending in a way. They are defending their cities while central government is still in Kiev. So they are able to mobilize their own people living inside the city, and to act sovereignly, in a way to act proactively. And with some tragic and some heroic pages already written in this story. Let's look at what's happening in Melitopol city in the south of Ukraine, which was taken by Russians, and they captured the mayor of this city, and he stayed a couple of days in captivity, and he never never betrayed Ukraine, never betrayed Ukrainian idea. And then he was freed by Ukrainian army by this kind of exchange. He was exchanged against, if I'm not mistaken, 9 or 10 officers, Russian army, and that's it's heroic example.
So
he was defending this Ukrainian idea, being a regional leader. So, I mean, these mayors, they are regional leaders. Look what's happening with Kim. Kim is a mayor of Mykolaiv. Mykolaiv is a heroic city as well in the southern Ukraine, which is fighting against Russian army for many weeks already, for many days already, and they are successful in this battle. And he's presenting videos of what he's doing every day, and these videos are extremely popular because he has his kind of humor, his kind of response to Russian aggression. And he's a regional leader inside Ukraine, and he defends Ukraine. And this is something which maybe doesn't exist in Russia. All this community of different people. You cannot compare Kim to Sadovy. Sadovy is mayor of Lviv, or to Klitschko. Vitaly Klitschko is mayor of Kiev. So there's a kind of network of independent people, independent, but they are working together for this common victory.
These are basically the knights. Knights meaning Knight, the medieval knights, or the princes, princes of this, medieval Rus, who are basically they have power themselves. So they are not powerless. What strikes me for example, with Russia, after all these sanctions imposed on top Russian oligarchs, and they're saying like Friedman or Deripaska or Abramovich, what they do? Are they making a comploy against Putin? No, they just take a plane, go to Dubai or somebody, and they're saying, look, we cannot do anything. We are powerless. So they are reproaching to the West. The West is imposing sanctions on them. They're saying, you understand nothing in Russian politics because we are helpless. We are powerless. Well, you guys are richest people in Russia, and you are powerless. And here in Ukraine, there is a mayor of a tiny city, Melitopol, with a Greek name. The city has a Greek name, and they having some power,
and they're resisting. With result and effectively. So just because they don't defend an idea of Zelensky being national leader or something, they are defending their own land, and they have some power and they have some capacities in place. And this is also because of this reform of decentralization. But not only. What you were talking about this historical perspective, yes, indeed, it's a kind of a network of people in places who defend their city, their village, their land, and there's a kind of personal attachment to that. This is not something abstract. This is not only about money and about power. This is about that this is real own land they are defending. They are mobilizing people. People trust them. So mayors, they are people who are elected. They are not appointed by central power. This is also important because that's why they have some credit in place. They have some respect and some trust in the communities, and that's why it is extremely difficult to fight in Ukraine, because you have several systems of defense and several systems of resistance. This is a resistance on the central level. I mean, army, armed forces, Zelensky, Minister of Defense, and all that kind of things. But at the same time, you have territorial defense. You have mayors in place who organize a lot of important things coming from water, electricity, some brigades in place, etc., etc. So you have plenty of networks to fight against, and this is not central. So even if you fight against Zelensky, you will not cancel the whole resistance. That's the point.
Exactly. And remember, during this self-governance reform a few years ago, we were talking that, look, there is some negative sides of it, because we are increasingly going into a new neo-feudal system when you have those mayors who are basically controlling not only their cities but also their whole oblasts. They were creating their own parties, for example. So it became so much decentralized. And we were saying that, look, Ukraine is turning into a new feudal state where, yes, there is a king, but then there are a bunch of oligarchs, big businessmen, these mayors, etc. It's extremely pluralistic, but also kind of dangerous, right? But now we see the positive sides of it, because they are not helpless. They are people who are used to an idea that they have power. They have power in their communities. And look, there is nothing in terms of no mayor is saying, okay, so maybe the central government is wrong, I would better go to the Russians and sign a separatist deal with them. Even those mayors who were basically not very much pro-Ukrainian, let's say they had their own game. I mean, the mayor of Odessa, mayor of Kharkiv, now they do not say anything about it. So why? Not because they are afraid of Zelensky or central government, because they are really thinking that they should defend their land and their city. And this local patriotism is very important for Ukraine. But again, it goes very deep into centuries.
And this is a part of the response to a question of who Ukrainians are and why this political system is much more effective than Russian one. Because in a way, this is a key difference. You started with saying that we have a different political culture. We don't have these top-down communication, top-down governance, and maybe this explains the force of Ukrainian resistance and the effectiveness of this system and this capacity to live and to survive even in this war. And in a way, I would say that it also explains the fragility of Russian system and their incapacity, in fact, to survive. Because we are convinced at that very point, we are both Ukrainians, and we are convinced that this is the last war of this regime. This is the last war of Russia. Let's hope so. And they will not survive this global isolation, these global sanctions, this resistance, real resistance in Ukraine, mainly because this culture and this political culture is composed of one person who started this nightmare on the global level, and a lot of millions of powerless people who are hostages of this situation. They're not innocent, but they can do nothing, in fact. Even if you're absolutely right saying that even the richest people in Russia, they're incapable to change something.
I remember.
And it means the end of Russia.
I remember the French philosopher Marquis de Custine, who was coming to Russia in 19th century and then wrote a brilliant book, La Russie en 1839, Russia in 1839. And I remember, it was quite a long time ago, 2 centuries away. And I remember that he was saying that, look, in Russia you have a Tsar, but then the highest person close to the Tsar is already a slave. So a Tsar and then the bunch of millions of slaves, which have no dignity compared to the Tsar. And basically that's what we have seen before the war, when Putin was talking to his subordinates, and we have seen these people who were supposed to be very powerful, who
like Narishkin,
who were actually slaves. And compare this to President Zelensky when he got the power. Of course, it's another naivety and utopian figure of speech, but when in his speech, one of his first speeches, he said, everybody is president, right? So, of course, it's a kind of type of Ukrainian populism, but with the very true idea that, yes, each Ukrainian citizen is basically has the center of his action and thinking in him or herself. Let us probably we are approaching the end of this episode, but we will try to continue to explain to you the roots of Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian identity, Ukrainian political identity. And just to make a bridge to probably the other episodes, let's talk about Cossacks, because the Cossacks is one of the cornerstone of Ukrainian political identity, is a warrior class, the class of warriors which was born around early 16th, maybe late 15th, early 16th century, on the borderlands with the big steppe. And people who were extremely interesting phenomenon, because it's also about self-organization. It's also about people who basically fled all the excesses of power in Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, who established some kind of self-governing republics in down to the Dnipro River, and creating kind of a semi-statehood which was very militarily oriented. So this is probably what now Ukraine looks like. A big warrior class, which is the most trusted in Ukrainian society, the army. And but at the same time, they were combining different cultures, because Cossack is a Turkic word initially. In their for example, in their clothes, you can see lots of these Orientalist elements. There are testimonies that there were lots of Muslims in earlier Cossacks from
but they were not using
Tatars.
Bayraktars.
Yeah.
Maybe they made difference
Yes,
between
yes,
Ukrainian
yes. And there are many influences by Turkish culture, by Crimean Tatar culture. So different religions, different cultures, but this spirit of a borderland warrior who is, fighting against the enemy in the open steppe.
And once again, the structure of this Cossack world, it was not top-down communication either, because it was a kind of hetman. Hetman was a leader. Yeah, but he was. It was always a vici like Maidan, like this gathering, yeah, with other Cossacks, where everybody had the right to raise his voice and to suggest something. So it was a military organization, but a kind of, if you compare to, it was not a regular army, It was a military unit, military organization with leader, but it was not organized in a way where somebody gave orders, and I mean the strict orders. And in a way, this also prototype what we were already talking about this down-top communication and between the structure, which is much more democratic, if we can say so.
Democratic or republican, I like the word republic, and there is tradition of this Polish republicanism, the Rzeczpospolita, where the feudals, the princes, the szlachta, played a very important role. But in Ukraine, it's very interesting how it transferred more down to the more down levels of society. For example, the warriors, the Cossacks, who were basically the new aristocracy, right? In their battle, who earned the dignity in their battle, and therefore they were challenging the old Schlachta, old aristocracy. But then this idea went in the 19th century to the peasants. And the paradox, maybe we will talk about it in our later episodes, the rebirth of Ukrainian nationhood in the 19th century through the poets like Taras Shevchenko or others, it was an idea of bringing the Cossack myth down to the people, down to the common people, to peasants, primarily to peasants. And this is something which is extremely interesting, extremely important. But coming back to Cossacks, basically the document that Ukrainians consider as their first constitution, the constitution of Philip Orlik in early 18th century, I consider it not so much as a constitution for people in our sense of the term, but rather an agreement between the hetman, the leader of the Cossacks, and the Cossacks. So it's a contractual version of politics. What does it mean? That not only hetman, not only the agreement between the leader and his army means that the leader accepts mutuality of obligations. That not only his army has obligations to him, but also he has obligations to ensure what it was called at that time and still called today the rights and freedoms. Rights and freedoms. Let's not forget that rights and freedoms, the very concept, is not invention of 20th or 21st century. It goes very deep in history, in European history, in feudal times, and basically to Roman times, ancient times, etc. And I think this is all very important, because when Ukrainian Cossacks under Bogdan Khmelnytsky tried to sign the deal with Moscovite Tsar, the Moscovite Tsar said that he does not accept any obligation with regard to Cossacks. That's the key difference. So they were talking in the 17th century with us with the language of autocracy. The Tsar has no obligation to you. You just, you are just his slaves. So this is the key difference, and we want our listeners to understand it. I think we will wrap up and we'll try to continue to explain these Ukrainian traditions for you in more detail in our next episodes. It was Explaining Ukraine podcast by UkraineWorld.org. This series, the war series, is brought to you by Internews Ukraine and Ukraine Crisis Media Center. Tetyana Ogarkova, who is in charge of international communications of Ukraine Crisis Media Center. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm chief editor of UkraineWorld.org. Support us on Patreon, patreon.com/UkraineWorld. Listen to us on SoundCloud, Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, and YouTube. And stay with us and stand with Ukraine.